Welcome to The Helping Conversation, an exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of facilitating trusting, safe, inclusive, and effective helping conversations with others. Recorded at RockVox Recording and Production Studios, Rochester, New York, Mouth Off at RockVox, rockvox.com. Having enjoyed an almost 40-year career facilitating his own authentic brand of the helping conversation, your host, executive and recovery coach, Keith Greer.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much, as always, for carving out some time in your busy day to sit in with us on this episode of The Helping Conversation. I know there have been a number of occasions on a number of episodes of our podcast where we have talked about, I don't think we've ever talked about it quite as in-depth as we're going to today, but we have talked about this concept of secondary trauma for those folks that are in the helping world, and that it is a very real thing. It is a thing, sadly, that I find in different corners of the helping world that I walk in, still tends to be minimized by both practitioners as well as the organizations that they work for. There are more and more workshops out there on either secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. But it's just a really interesting phenomenon in the world of helping because it is one of the realities. I was just having a conversation with a group of folks, some coaches that I'm training, and specifically in the world of substance use disorder, where I think this is such a relevant topic. And we were talking about that one of the realities for them in choosing to work in the field as recovery coaches is that they are working with a disease where at times people die from it, and in some really troubling and sad and complex ways. And are they ready for that? And do they understand what that potential impact might be on them as a group of inherently very caring and compassionate and empathic people? And so in our field, it is just such a profoundly important conversation that we need to have, both for individuals who work in the field as well as the organizations that employ them. And we are going to really dig in to this topic today with our guest, who I am just so excited to have her with us because, as I said, this is taking. She takes this conversation to a whole nother level in terms of our need to be aware of it and how to address it on both the individual and organizational level. So I wanted to read something that came off of just some of the information I found out about my guest, and then I will introduce her. And she works within the world of working with refugees and displaced people. And so it said, through the course of her work at the crossroads of the government and humanitarian sectors, my guest witnessed a disconnect across organizations that celebrated the resilience of the human spirit in the refugees and displaced persons whom they served, while failing to acknowledge or protect the humanity within their own organizations. Exposure to traumatic events and danger, long working hours, stress, and frequent, often back-to-back deployments abroad, in this case, meant that humanitarians were at a high risk of developing depression, burnout, and anxiety. A survey run by The Guardian in 2015 found that 79% of respondents had experienced mental health issues, and 93% say they were related to work. A separate study found that only 20% of humanitarian workers, and we're going to define that in a second, felt that their organizations were supporting them. Over 50% said that they'd experienced or been diagnosed with anxiety, and 44% with depression. Panic attacks and post-traumatic stress injuries were cited among over 1/5 of these staff. Those are some frightening and worrisome statistics, and especially that part of people's sense that I am working somewhere that celebrates the work that I do and minimizes the impact on me as a human being. So let me introduce my guest, Dimple Dhabalia. How are you, Dimple?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you here. I'm looking so forward to this conversation. So let me share with everybody a little bit of who Dimple is and what she does and what she's bringing to this conversation. Dimple is a leadership, mindfulness, and well-being coach and is the founder of her organization, Roots in the Clouds. She has spent the past 20 years doing humanitarian work, or what she refers to as high human impact work, HHI. First time I've ever heard this concept, and I love it. It makes so much sense. High human impact work is that which seeks to improve the lives of others and alleviate suffering in the world. The designation is not unique to any particular sector or profession. However, the thread that generally binds individuals in HHI fields is a sense of duty, a connection to a larger mission of service and caring for others. Regardless of job, title, or profession, if you work in an HHI profession and you're in the business of serving others and alleviating human suffering, you are a humanitarian. Those that work within this specific profession not only contend with the uncertainty, ambiguity, and complexity of daily life, but also face unique occupational stressors like compassion fatigue, burnout, and organizational trauma, which have become the norm within HHI organizations across various sectors over the past couple of decades. And yet it seems that the very organizations that are doing the work to serve humanity often forget that mission-driven individuals within their ranks are, first and foremost, human too. Dimple's mission is to put the human back into humanitarian work by supporting emerging and seasoned leaders across the sector to create brave spaces where they can do their own inner work. Specializing in mindfulness and positive psychology, two things we're definitely going to talk about, Dimple supports leaders and organizations across high human impact sectors in designing human-centered workplace cultures where head, heart, and metrics work together to create nimble organizations that can thrive and grow even in the midst of uncertainty and challenge, and where empathy and social connection are at the heart of the employee experience. Dimple also serves as an accredited executive coach in the Treasury Executive Institute, received a certificate in applied positive psychology in March 2019, and is one of only 10 certified mindful performance enhancement awareness and knowledge instructors in the federal government. Prior to her work on global migration efforts, Dimple worked as an assistant attorney general representing the Department of Human Services at the Colorado Attorney General's office. Dimple has a JD from the University of Denver, College of Law, a BA in Institutions and Policies, and a PPE degree from William Jewell College and Oxford University. Again, please join me in welcoming Dimple Dhabalia to the Helping Conversation.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get started because there is, a whole lot to unpack just in what I have read so far. So I always like to begin, Dimple, at the beginning and just have you share just kind of a quick synopsis of what your professional journey has been that has you at this place where you have decided to create an entire organization to shine a light on the impact of folks who work in the high human impact sector.
Great. So again, thank you so much for having me. My career progression has been kind of circuitous. It's interesting that I've ended up here. I kind of have had a mindset of wanting to serve others for many, many years. Like I grew up that way. And when I went to law school, I ended up coming out and working at the Attorney General's office in Colorado in a very small unit that was focused on representing the state in cases around the Central Registry for Child Protection. And so in that work, I was introduced to this concept of vicarious trauma because I had an amazing boss who recognized that the work that we were doing was hard and that it can have an impact on us over time. And at the time, I was a very young attorney, a little bit cocky probably. And I remember going to this training that we had to go to thinking like, I don't need this. I'm fine. You know, I can eat lunch. I can eat a sandwich while I'm reviewing these cases, which looking back now is probably a red flag of some kind. But Yeah, and so that kind of planted a seed for me, though. And I always knew that I wanted to do some kind of work in international human rights. And so after that position, I ended up moving to California. Um, and the one day I was just looking for other jobs. I was working at a small private firm. It did not feel great to me. It was not a good fit. And I ended up coming across the asylum officer job posting. And on paper, it was truly my dream job. It was everything that I was already kind of doing on my own in terms of researching, human rights of different countries and things like that. And so I ended up getting hired. It was incredible. It has been such an incredible career field. And so I've had the opportunity to interview asylum seekers all
Mm.
over the United States. And then I've traveled all over the world to interview refugees in, either urban settings or in refugee camps, things like that. And in about 7 years into doing this work, which was about 10 years after that initial vicarious trauma training, I was on assignment in Zambia, and I just started. It was a really tough trip. We were interviewing the last of the 94 Rwandan genocide
Oh
survivors. We were
my.
interviewing Congolese applicants, and we were interviewing a group called, they were protracted Burundians. So these were people from Burundi who had been born and raised in refugee camps and then were subsequently attacked again. And so, uh, really, really tough cases. Every case had some element of rape. The cases with the Rwandans, it was mixed Hutu Tutsi couples, and so really trying to figure out if most of the husbands were Hutu and the Hutus were the ones who committed all the atrocities. So
Right.
really trying to figure out, were they involved in any way? It was tough. And it was the first time that I really started experiencing, I was having a hard time controlling my emotions during interviews. I would leave the interview site and my team, we would just go out, have a drink, and then we'd end up staying there for several hours. And so it was not like super, it was not good. And then I was really having trouble sleeping. And when I did sleep, I had really bad nightmares. My heart was constantly racing. So I had a lot of these different symptoms happening.
Right.
And I knew that something didn't feel right. And so as a result of that, when I got back to my home office, which at the time was in Athens, Greece, I started doing some research because, anytime you talk about things that are like mental health related, so much stigma, and especially in the government, and especially at that time, it wasn't something you talked about. And what I found interesting was the more that I researched it, the more I realized that in this particular kind of humanitarian sector, this was a pretty common
Sure.
occurrence for people who had been doing the work for a while. And so that kind of, the seed that had been planted about 10 years earlier, coupled with that, just made me realize, okay, this is kind of an occupational challenge that is what I'm experiencing. And so as a result of that, I was able to, when I came back to the States, I rotated back, I ended up in a position where I had a little bit of a platform. And so I was able to start, making sure that we were offering some trainings around just these kinds of like, again, what I call occupational challenges or occupational hazards of the work. And also, how do we practice self-care and things like that. And then um, even as I was offering that, I was not taking my own advice as much as I should. And so when I got posted overseas again, I was still offering this to the teams that I was taking out into different uh, like refugee trips and things like that. This was the height of the refugee crisis in 2015, and I ended up just getting really sick, and it was because again I hadn't been addressing these issues at that time, and so my body was responding accordingly, and so I ended up having to curtail the assignment. But when I came back, I ended up in a position where I really could facilitate change, and so as a result, ended up standing up, a program in house to really start looking at some of these issues, normalizing the conversation, and really trying to remove some of the stigma associated with this kind of, these kinds of occupational challenges.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious, when you started that, you said you finally had a bit of a platform, but you also have mentioned the stigma that we know is alive and well around mental health and mental illness. And so even at that moment with that platform, when you started to raise these issues, what were some of the responses that you received?
Yeah. Well, even to this day, I'll say, I just did a training last week for a lot of our new staff coming in. And there's still very much a sense that, I don't need this. I
Mm,
am stronger than this. I'm resilient. And we use a lot of that language. We're trying to really educate leadership around the use of the word resilient,
right.
especially in these times with the pandemic and stuff, because it often can lead to a lot of shame for people who maybe aren't feeling that way. Um, uh, and so one of the things that I've really been talking about to people is just that, um, experiencing these things and talking about them doesn't make you weak. It makes you human,
Right.
right? And so, but yeah, that's a lot of the pushback is just this resistance to the idea that, and also this idea that mental health is somehow just so much worse than, our physical health or our
Right.
relational health. But they're all, I mean, they should all be treated equally. They're all important and they make us the whole human being that we are. And so it's really important that we're looking at all of them. And so really just trying to get people out of that mindset.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating what you're saying about the word resilient, because it's such a strength-based word, right? And it's something really positive when we have conversations with people about their resilience factors. But it's fascinating that here's a place where maybe that word doesn't work, that it blocks people from looking at some of the realities of the hazards of their work.
Yeah, and also it just, yeah, it definitely blocks them from viewing the realities, but also uh it sets up this false sense of like you have to operate at this level, otherwise there's something wrong with you,
Right.
and there's nothing wrong with you. It's everybody reacts to this kind of work in different ways. It all depends on kind of a lifetime of experiences and the lens through which we experience the world. And that's part of what we're really trying to train on now is the neuroscience behind this. And, how do we understand how the brain works and the fact that, we can have a whole lot of people experience the exact same thing and have, like 10 people experience the same thing and 10 people are going to have very different reactions for
Right.
very different reasons.
Right. Right. So I really want to dig into that in doing this work and in doing some of this training, both internally within your organization and externally within your own world that you're creating your coaching business. What are some of the models or modalities that you structure your training on, that you hang your training on, that evidence tells us is effective in helping people deal with the many of these really intense stressors of doing this work?
Um, that's a great question. So I look at it at two different levels. So on the first level is just the individual level. So individual and organizational. So on the individual level, everything that we do is really based on a foundation of mindfulness.
Okay.
And so when we talk about mindfulness, we're really talking about three key things that we're helping people develop. So first of all is self-awareness, because that awareness is really key to everything, right? Like if we can't notice our own thoughts, if we can't notice our own emotions, if we can't notice where in the body those things are showing up, we have a really hard time actually making change, right? Or facilitating change. So that self-awareness is really key. The second piece is self-compassion,
Hmm.
because I think, we are just, it's human nature. We're very tough on ourselves. We've got that inner critic that's loud and proud, always ready to let us know that we're messing everything up.
Yeah.
And so we really want to start creating, this space where people can bring that sense of kindness that we would give to a friend or someone who we saw was suffering or in need, really turning that onto ourselves so that we don't need somebody else to do that for us. And then the third, and the idea is that if we can have this self-awareness, if we can have this self-compassion, that ultimately we'll be in a better place to self-regulate. And so, and that self-regulation is the point at which, in real time, we can make better choices and we can make decisions that are going to serve us in a good way. And so that's kind of the first piece of this. And then organizationally, we're looking at really, for me, it's very much about a human-centered approach,
Right.
Working to create psychological safety in the workplace. And I say this because I know that a lot of organizations think, well, yeah, obviously, that makes sense, and that's what we do. But most organizations don't have a human-centered approach.
Right.
We often create policies and identify workloads and things like that based on a variety of factors, but how it's going to impact the workforce isn't always at, the front and center in terms of how policies are determined. And so the idea here is that we look at, the people, the human capital that we have as, the most important piece of this, and that we build things around them and their needs. And I know that's a controversial statement because I think there's a lot of perception out there that we can't build workplaces that way, that we have a certain bottom line, we have certain metrics that we have to meet and things like that. But I would say that if we can recognize the humanity in each person that's on our staff and understand that, again, that they're whole human beings with lives that are complex and involve so much more than just the work. If we can bring all of that together and really understand that, we're going to actually set people up for success, and we're going to create a space where they're going to feel connected, they're going to feel like they belong, they're going to feel like they're a part of something, so that's where we start to see that people are happier, they're healthier, they're better focused, and ultimately it does help with the production and things like that. And then the other piece of this that applies to both the organization and the individual is what we call above the line thinking. And so this came out of, there's a group called the Conscious Leadership Group. And so they came up with this model, this above the line model. And so the idea is that if you imagine that every moment in your life is represented by a thin black line. And at any given moment, we're either operating from above the line or below the line. And so when we're above the line, we're open, we're curious, we're non-judgmental, we're really committed to learning. And when we're below the line, we're closed off, we're defensive, we are very judgmental, and we are committed to just being right. That's all we care about.
Right.
And so really, if you think about growth mindset, fixed mindset, it's a very similar kind of approach. And so focus a lot of my time on training organizations and individuals on this idea of what do we need to do. It's not that we're going to operate from above the line all the time.
Right.
But again, that's where that awareness comes in, because if we can recognize where we are at a given moment, then we have the capacity to choose. And, we can stay where we are. Maybe that's where we want to be, or we can choose to do something different. All
right. So you just gave me a whole bunch of stuff that we could turn into about 3 hours worth of conversation. So I want to back up about a few things. So first of all, when you talked about challenging organizations to think differently about how they're created so that they meet the needs of the people who work in it, you use the word controversial, and I'll challenge you on that. There is nothing controversial about that at all. I respect that it's a challenging conversation because organizations historically have been built from the standpoint of what's best for the organization, not necessarily what's best for the people who work in it. But it's an idea that makes total sense. I don't know how anybody could argue with you about it. It's just, how do we make an organization attend to the needs of the people who make up the organization versus the entity itself? So I wanted to read something, from that you have written about designing human-centered workplaces, because I just think it's brilliant and it makes total sense. So imagine what would be possible if high human impact organizations shifted. And I'm going to put, for me, I have never done the kind of work you've talked about, Dimple, but working in mental health, working in the substance use disorder world, I know the impact on the people who work there. So imagine what would be possible if high human impact organizations shifted toward designing human-centered workplaces where head, heart, and metrics work together to attract, retain, and motivate heart-centered individuals, where workforce well-being drove policymaking. What an idea that is. Where workplace cultures were intentionally built to foster a sense of equity, connection, belonging, and appreciation, so all employees felt seen, heard, and valued. That is a powerful paragraph.
Thank you.
And so as you have gone out and presented this concept, especially this organizational systemic concept, again, I'm sitting here thinking, who's going to argue with you on it? But I'm curious what the response has been.
Yeah, so I take your point in terms of calling it controversial. And the reason I say controversial is I agree. I think when people hear this as a concept, it's great, right? Why wouldn't we want to do this? And why wouldn't we want to create these kind of workplaces?
Right.
I think the other side of this, though, is a lot of these organizations that are mission driven. So whether you're looking at kind of the organizations that you have worked with,
right,
that you support, or you look at it in the humanitarian sector, there's so much what we call organizational trauma that's been built up over years. And so when we talk about organizational trauma, we're looking at all these, so again, that idea that we have this ethos that we are here to protect people, to, protect vulnerable or marginalized populations, and to help. And yet we have these workforces that aren't getting extended those same kinds of things, right? And so over time, what ends up happening is we've got a lot of organizations where the bottom line has driven the policies, right, at any cost. And it's left this impression that people are replaceable. And if they burn out, okay, fine, we've got
find
5
another
more
person
ready to come in and do the job. And so there's that piece of it. And then, we look at right now, there's been this kind of reemergence around everyone talking about, oh, we need more diversity and inclusion. We need more diversity and inclusion. And I just gave a speech recently, and I talked about how, diversity and inclusion is not it's not a program, and it's not like trainings. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, we're talking about something that needs to be woven into the fabric of the culture.
Right.
And, and inclusion itself isn't enough anymore, because we really need to think about this idea of belonging, because inclusion is like, hey, I'm going to open the door and I'm going to invite you to sit at the table with me. But if I don't actually feel like I belong at that table, it defeats the whole purpose. And so belonging is where we're really, giving people that seat at the table, but also we are allowed to use our voice to co-create with every other person in the room. And this has not been happening, right, for a long time in many organizations. And so we've got that piece of it. And then you've got just kind of the like microaggressions and things that have happened over the years. Right. And so all of these things kind of create this culture, that this traumatized culture, where people then are just, they feel like they're just widgets, or, just there to kind of do the work, and that they're not really the focus. And so it's hard, because what ends up happening is we give this analogy of the water that we swim in. So if you think about there's a great a video, David Foster Wallace had done a commencement speech, and there's a nice video that goes with it called "This is Water." And in it, these 2 fish are swimming along, and then this older fish swims by, and he says, "Oh, good morning, boys. How's the water?" And everyone keeps swimming along. And then the 2 fishes kind of look at each other, and they're like, what the heck is water? Right. And we're so immersed in this kind of toxic space that we don't even notice that it's happening anymore.
Yeah.
And so that's where that's where I see some of the disconnect happening, because I can come in, I can present all these ideas, and a lot of times, organizations feel like, well, yeah, but we're already doing this. We're offering a well-being program. We're offering these different things. We're talking about a diversity and inclusion program. But, if we don't step back and actually look at the root issues that are contributing towards, these workspaces that don't feel that great, that feel somewhat toxic, or that feel like, that have high rates of attrition and things like that. And if we're not addressing the root causes, that's where we have a problem. And that's
Right.
really where I see a lot of the pushback happening.
Yeah.
It's just people don't see that
They
part.
don't see it. I have to say, because you use the word belonging, I was just in a training over the weekend, and the woman who was doing a specific workshop I was in came in and talked about doing DBI work. I'm thinking, what is DBI work? Because I had never heard the belonging part. That it is not just about diversity and inclusion; it's this belonging piece. But anyway, so I want to back up and ask you a question. So, if I'm hearing you correctly, you would separate the phenomena of organizational trauma, separate that from the phenomena of the trauma any individual is experiencing. Those are two different things?
They're different, but they're connected.
Right.
And so when I talk about trauma, I usually explain it like you can think about trauma as like a layer cake,
Okay.
right? And so, especially for individuals in the workplace. So that first layer is just your everyday little things that are happening. So, I had a bad commute. I woke up late. My kids are acting up. I had an issue with my partner, whatever. Those kind of things that change day to day.
Right.
Then the second layer is kind of that chronic ongoing stress. And so this is the stuff that sticks with us year after year and just continues to build. And then the third layer is critical incident stress. And so this
Mm-hmm.
is where, we've got those individual incidents, the death of a loved one, we've got a terrorist attack, we've got, mass shooting, things like that. And then the fourth layer is where you start to see the organizational trauma start to come in. And then on top of that, you can add in things like the intergenerational trauma. You can add in, bigger things like the pandemic, all those kinds of additional things come on top. And so it's very, it's complex and it's layered like that. And so, yes, they're separate, but they also tend to
Right.
show up together.
Right. So I wanted to back up even a little bit more to your points about mindfulness work, because your first bullet about self-awareness, man, is that challenging. I don't just speak for me, right? To really, really, really put myself in the here and now. I'm a wonderful time traveler. I can spend a lot of time in the future and a lot of time in the past. For me, I tend to spend more time in the future. To be in the here and now is challenging for us human beings. And yet I agree with you wholeheartedly that as a first step of being able to slow down enough and just say, where am I in this moment in thought and feeling and experience? So I'm wondering if you could give an example in your work with folks, what might be either some strategies or techniques or suggestions that can help a person who's going to look at you and say, self-awareness, be in the here and now. I have no idea, Dimple, how to make that happen.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right. It's human nature. We live in fast forward or rewind,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Rarely
yeah.
are we just right here in this moment. And so, we talk a lot about, I teach a course called MPEAK, which is Mindful Performance Enhancement, Awareness, and Knowledge. And so it brings together that cross-section of mindfulness and performance. And so the idea is when we're talking about self-awareness and cultivating self-awareness, we look to things like meditation, right? And a lot of people say, well, I can't meditate. I've tried it. I can't shut my thoughts down, and meditation is not about shutting our thoughts down because we are human beings. We've got brains, we've got minds. And we often will say the brain pumps thoughts like the heart pumps blood. So it's constant.
I like that.
Yeah. And so it's not about shutting down our thoughts. It's about changing our relationship to them. And so part of this is, when we engage in these practices. So for example, when we engage in a practice to do like a body scan, for example, we're bringing our focus to individual parts of the body as a way to cultivate that sense of focusing in on one thing. When we focus on the breath, that's another way where we're building that that kind of muscle memory of focus. And all of this is related. There's so much brain science behind this now. They've done a lot of fMRI studies that show that the more that we do these kinds of practices, and again, the research shows something like 10 minutes a day for 4 weeks straight, shows some significant changes in our brain structure. And so this idea of neuroplasticity, we have the capacity to really rewire our brain so that when we're in a place of challenge or difficulty, instead of defaulting to whatever our patterns have been, we can now do exactly what we're talking about, which is like, okay, I can use this model of above the line, below the line to ask myself that question of where am I right now?
Right.
And I can start to notice, right? So the other big piece of this is that mind-body connection, because oftentimes our body is aware of something happening before our brain cognitively is able to catch up and know that. And so the ability to start tuning into the body and connecting emotions to body sensations is a really big piece of this. So we spend a lot of time on that, this idea of interoceptive awareness. So noticing what are the signals that my body is giving me that something is going on. And what emotion does that relate to?
Right.
When is this showing up for me? And so we can start to map out. We have what's called the cycle of conditioned reactions. And so there's some kind of a triggering event, which really automatically kind of ends up being, some kind of body sensation that corresponds to that. And then from there, we can start to notice there's an immediate mind chatter that starts to happen, right? Again, that inner critic, that inner voice that's just constantly going. And so that body sensation leads to, whatever thoughts are coming up around that. And then we move into one of 5 ways that we react. And so we all have heard of fight, flight, or freeze. And then there's also fix or fake. And so when we talk about fight, we're talking about, either physically getting into an altercation, but also things like blame and judgment. These fall under flight, and we can, that can be directed towards ourselves or directed outwards towards others. And then flight is anything that's going to allow us to avoid the emotional thing that we don't want to do, right? So this is where, again, we can get up and physically leave wherever we're at, or, excuse me, we can end up, this is where we see a lot of those numbing behaviors. We see a lot of the isms, right? But it's also where we see an inability to connect with other people. This is where we see these walls coming up. Freeze is that paralysis by analysis, or overthinking everything. Fix is kind of an if-then. We play these games with ourselves. If I could just lose 10 pounds, I'd be more lovable.
Yeah.
If I could produce more, I'd be more valuable to my agency, right? And so we're constantly going after something and never quite achieving it. And then fake is this is where we see a lot of those perfectionistic tendencies coming up, and a desire not to be vulnerable. I'm not going to ask for help. I'm not going to let people know I'm struggling. I'm just going to, let people think that I'm fine, I'm good, everything's great. And so we have these patterned ways of thinking, and all of these are related to again, that lens through which we experience the world, which has been built up through a lifetime of experiences. And so then that feeds into kind of the beliefs that we have about ourselves, or becomes part of our identity, which then feeds into kind of those self-limiting beliefs, and then it just becomes like a pattern.
Right.
So yeah,
I love this. I have never heard the fix or fake part. That's awesome. I've never heard that as a part of the fight, flight, freeze, appease. Sometimes I hear. I'm assuming, Dimple, that this entire process, of being impacted by vicarious trauma in this work, is made even more complex if you are a person who walks around your world having had trauma perpetrated on you at some time in your own life.
Absolutely. So we talk about this idea of a window of tolerance. right? So window of tolerance, when we're in, if you imagine like a window, the window of tolerance is the middle section. And in that middle section, this is where life is good.
Yeah.
Like we have challenges, but we can manage. Things are going pretty well. Um, but when we're outside of our window of tolerance, if we're on the top half of or the top part of the window, we're in this zone of kind of hyper arousal. Right. And so that's where that anxiety is. That's where we've got the racing heart, that kind of thing. But if we're at the bottom part of the window, then we're in the hypoarousal. So this is where we're shutting down. This
Yeah.
is where we're numbing. And so, again, using this mindfulness, we can really start to notice when we are outside of our window of tolerance. And if you have previous trauma, your window of tolerance might be a lot more narrow
Right.
than somebody who hasn't experienced
Right.
that. Right. And so part of this is really being able to understand, like, what kinds of things am I bringing with me and how does that impact my window?
Right.
But then what are some of the tools that I have to start widening my window? Because we have that capacity to widen our window. And the wider that our window is, the more that we can actually deal with ambiguity, the more we can deal with challenges
Right.
and stress and everything else. But that additional trauma really helps to shrink the window.
Yeah. 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 I'm getting this picture that your work, your work requires you to walk with people in some of their darkness, in some of their secrets. Not only the stigma you talked about when we started of I am being impacted by this work that I do, but maybe even for some folks who are walking around with their own history of trauma, that's often stuff they've never talked about. I find it's even often stuff people have never even self-identified as trauma, yet impacts their world every day. So I'm thinking there's an aspect of this training you do that is pretty vulnerable making for people, to ask them to start looking at some aspects of themselves, both maybe in the past and in the here and now, that are pretty challenging places and vulnerable making places to be.
Absolutely. And I think you raise a really good point, which is, there are a lot of mindfulness trainings out there.
Right.
It's so important to find trauma sensitive or trauma informed mindfulness courses, and to find instructors who are trauma informed, because mindfulness has an opposite end, right? Which is that the other side of mindfulness is if you are someone who has experienced a lot of trauma, mindfulness can actually bring up a lot of that, and it can exacerbate it. And so if you're working with an instructor or a practitioner who doesn't have, that understanding or that background, it could actually kind of make things a little bit worse. And so we certainly don't want to put people in that position. And I say that because I think it's important for us to explain that and to let people know that. But having said that, we also know that mindfulness is an incredible tool for people as well.
Yeah. So could you give us an example? Someone comes through your training, gets to a different place. It sounds like in your own work, you're at a different place now when you walk into some of the high human impact work that you do. So I'm now back doing my work, and you described some of the people you're interviewing, that the trauma in the room is so profound. So if I was at a better place in how I cope with that, what would an example of that be? Because I'm still in these conversations that are so difficult and so painful.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for example, the group that I trained last week, one of the things we talk about is oftentimes when we get into this place of spinning, it's because we're in our heads, right? And so if we've just listened to this story of trauma, we can start to get into our heads about it, and we'll just like ruminate on it and keep thinking about it. And so one of the things, one of the easiest ways to kind of, well, I shouldn't say easiest, but one way that you can start to kind of move away from this is in real time is we want to get out of our heads and into our bodies. The quicker that we can get into our bodies, it breaks that kind of cycle that we could be in,
right?
And gives us a little bit of distance. so we can notice, again, what's happening. And so we have like a couple of exercises that we can do. And the other part of this is when we're in this place of spinning, we're very much in that fight or flight mode,
Yes.
right? And so we've engaged our sympathetic nervous system. And so what we really want to do is we want to access the vagus nerve so that we can start to access the parasympathetic nervous system and bring ourselves back down.
Right.
And so the breath is an incredible way to it's directly connected to the nervous system. And we look at the vagus nerve as like a toggle switch between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So something as simple as taking 3 deep breaths after an interview like that can serve to just bring things down a little bit and engage that vagus nerve to help us calm down. The other thing, though, is we've got 2 other practices that we talk about. First is something called the 5-finger exercise. And so this is where we can do this anywhere, and it just engages our senses. So it gets us out of our heads, gets us into our body through our senses. And so we use our fingers as and the senses as an anchor. And we start with just 5 things that you can see in this moment, right? So it gets us into the present moment. 4 things that you can feel or touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And just going through that exercise, and the beauty of that one is you can do it anywhere. Nobody has to know that you're doing it. But it's a quick way to just ground yourself. Another thing is we often tell people who are in crisis, something as simple as just saying, feel your feet, right? And again, just bringing your attention to the feet, which are grounded, they're on, they've got a stable floor under them, and really just feeling into that. And so there's something another aspect of that is called a contact practice. So there's 3 parts to that, where you feel your feet grounded on the floor, you feel your legs and your butt kind of grounded to the seat wherever you're sitting.
Right.
And you feel your hands either on your lap or against each other. And then once you've kind of identified all 3 of those things, you can focus your attention where you feel the contact the strongest.
Right.
And then you just focus your attention there for, anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes. And if your mind starts to wander, you just bring it back to wherever the contact is. And again, it's just a quick way to get us out of our heads into the body.
Yeah. Yeah. Would these all fall under the category? Sometimes I've heard them referred to as somatic practices.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
That just take us into body sensation and out of that our spinning head.
Exactly.
Right. That's awesome. Could you say the 5-finger exercise again? That sounded really good.
Yeah. So 5 fingers, we're engaging our 5 senses. So we start with 5 things that you can see in this moment. You just go around labeling the 5 things. 4 things that you can feel or touch in this moment. 3 things that you can hear in this moment. 2 things that you can smell in this moment. And 1 thing that you can taste in this moment.
Yeah, I'm picturing if I'm busy doing that, there's no way. We're not very good at multitasking, right? So there's no way I can be in my body and spinning in my head at the same time.
Yes, multitasking is a myth.
Isn't it?
Honestly, we think we're multitasking. We most definitely are not.
Right.
The brain is actually quickly moving back and forth between tasks.
Yeah. And we're not paying really good attention to either.
We're not good at it.
Yeah. That's awesome. And so again, I want to go back to, because I can see how meaningful this would be to individuals who are coming to you and have experienced some of the impact of high human impact work. But I want to go back to the systems and organizational piece. So as you go out and do this kind of training, you said it a little while ago that it's not enough for you to walk into a room and talk about diversity and inclusion, and you do your hour, dog and pony show, and you leave, and the company can say, "Oh, we feel good. We brought in someone like Dimple," and doesn't do anything. So you go in and do this kind of training with staff, which is really going deep. I'm making the assumption your programs are not, a 1-2 hour you show up and it's all done.
Yeah.
So what's your sense at the end of the day, as you've been doing this work with individuals, in the impact on their organizations, on the ability of the larger entity to say, what's our role in this besides just freeing up our staff to go and work with Dimple?
Well, and that's, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head though, right? So there is this idea of, okay, we're going to free up staff to do this particular thing. We're going to give them the time to do
Right.
this. But again, this is where I feel like there's a lot of articles out there about, in-house well-being programs are not the key. And part of this is because until we start changing our mindset around this has to become part of the culture, right?
Yes.
So this idea of well-being, holistic well-being. So again, like I run a leadership program too. And when I first started talking to a lot of the leaders, there was always this discussion about, well, yeah, but I'm not going to talk to my team about my feelings, or I don't want to hear about their feelings. Like, they're here to work. We're all here to work, and that's it. And this is where, I think this is a very interesting dynamic that's happened over generations, like since the Industrial Revolution, right? Like that really created these workplaces that were like, you go in, you work a set number of hours, you do the work, you leave. And we created these dynamics around what a workplace was supposed to be like. But
Right.
What we've learned over the years, and as we've seen the impact of that way of working, is that we've got workforces that are not happy.
Yeah.
And that as a result of not being happy, they are not healthy. And so we see a lot of organizations struggle with attrition. We see a lot of organizations struggling to retain talent and, institutional knowledge and that kind of thing. And so, we want to start looking at how do we create these spaces? How do we move away from that and get leaders to understand that vulnerability it's not a bad word, right?
Right.
Vulnerability does not mean that we have to share our entire life story. But vulnerability is what's going to allow us to act with empathy and compassion and meet people where they're at and understand. Again, it's this idea of understanding that people are whole human beings. And as much as we try to compartmentalize, if I come into work, I'm not leaving a piece of myself at the door.
Yeah.
Like if something has happened at home, that's probably
Yeah.
going to be distracting me as I'm working, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so if we can start to acknowledge that and notice that and, and the impact that has on somebody's, experience at work, then we can, that's going to inform like how we create, our numbers, how we determine like what kind of metrics we're going to set up, things like that.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were saying that it would be nice to help our systems understand, that vulnerability isn't a bad word. In my head, I was thinking, how do we even get past that to just the reality that us human beings spend some part of every day in vulnerability, and it's just a part of the natural human experience. And yet we have also been taught we hide that and we keep that in the dark and we don't talk about that. And as you said, it gets equated with weakness. So given all of that, you're talking about inviting people that you work with into a very vulnerable conversation. So one of the things I'm always interested in, and I usually ask this way at the start of the podcast, in your work when you walk in, what are some strategies, some ways of being that you bring into the room to quickly attend to your need, along with the folks in the room, to create and hold this space of trust and safety so that vulnerability work can be done?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think this is important for facilitators in general is I spend a lot of time on container building. And so right up front, from the very beginning is, there's a really great poem called Invitation to Brave Space. It's by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. And she was one of the, I don't know if she was a founder or she's somehow involved with a group called the People's Supper. And the poem talks about how we are going to work together to create the space. It's not going to be a perfect space because we're not perfect, but that we'll work together to create it however it needs to be created. And so I always start every session with that as kind of a foundation.
Awesome.
And then we spend a good amount of time actually talking about what do you need to create what we call a brave space, because safe spaces don't exist for everybody. And so we want to create a brave space. And what do you need to be able to show up and be yourself and feel comfortable, being yourself in this space?
Right.
And we start with that, and really kind of open it up for discussion. If we're in a place where we're able to do it, in terms of the platform we're using and things like that, if it's virtual, then we will put people into breakout rooms so they can kind of talk through what they need. And what we find is there's always a handful of things that are common in every group, things like confidentiality, things like respect, not talking all over each other, things like that, being open, being curious. And so what we end up doing is we ultimately end up creating a set of operating agreements for our time together. And then, I always ask, is this something that everyone feels comfortable agreeing to?
Right.
And then we move forward. And what's been really interesting to me is, I've done this both in an in-person setting and now virtually, because most of our trainings have been virtual. And it's effective.
Yes, it is.
In both, and it's amazing to me how just taking that time up front creates this space where people actually feel comfortable opening up and sharing with others. And we end up creating really tight-knit groups. And it's really, really beautiful.
Yeah.
So that's something I would really recommend.
Yeah. It's a very powerful conversation. And as you said, it's not even a conversation that really requires a whole lot of a lot of clock time. It's simply bringing people's attention to it and giving people permission to define what safe space or brave space or trusting space would look like, sound like, and feel like to them. And yes, such a powerful exercise. Yeah. So I'm looking at the clock and we're already 57 minutes into this. So I knew we'd need 2 or 3 hours, which simply means that there's most likely somewhere, Dimple, going to be a part 2 to this conversation, because this is just such important work that you're doing. So I wanted to ask 2 last questions. There's an aspect of our work, and it sounds like you very much model this in the training you do, that is about being as strength-based as possible in helping people identify capacity and strength and talent. And so I want to ask you, what are some strengths you bring to the work that you do?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I already kind of talked about this idea of the above the line, below the line thinking.
Right.
That's a really big one for me, is really walking the talk on that and being able to notice where I am at any given moment and making those choices accordingly. Something I've been thinking a lot about, especially this year with the pandemic and stuff, again, is really this idea of seeing the humanity in every single person that you interact with, because I don't think that's easy, right? It's hard, especially when we feel divided and we feel, the way that things have been going around the world right now. It's hard, but I feel like there's some kind of humanity in every person. So that's something that I've really been trying to lean into.
Yeah.
And then the other, my strengths are interesting. I actually, in my coaching, I work with people using the VIA strengths.
Oh, me too. I love that
assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And VIA actually was created by the founders of the positive psychology movement.
Right. Exactly.
And so it's such a great assessment. And my number one strength is appreciation for beauty and excellence. And I remember when I initially got that, I was like, what kind of a strength is this? And I was like, I feel like leadership should be at the top of mine or whatever.
Right.
But what I've learned is, as I really started to wrap my brain around it, is I do tend to find like beauty in unusual places or in
Yeah.
places that most people would not see. And so I
Right.
really try to tap into that quite a bit. Gratitude is a really big one for me.
Mm.
I spend a lot of time, even my signature block, I write with gratitude,
Yeah.
because it's a good reminder for me that there is always something to be grateful
Yeah.
for.
Yeah.
And trying to find that in the people that you're working with, or especially if it's someone that you're feeling challenged with, trying to find something for which you can be grateful can be really powerful.
Yeah.
Compassion and empathy is definitely something that I lean into. And with empathy, in this line of work, especially, we talk a lot about empathy as a double-edged sword, right? Because we have to be empathetic in the work that we're doing, but that empathy can also be the thing that ends up getting you to a place of burnout.
Yes.
And so with empathy, I really think about this idea of being able to meet people where they're at, but then also not having to fix anything.
Yeah.
Really, for me, like empathy is really thinking about, how do I let this person know that I care?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's just as simple as being able to listen.
Yeah.
And then the other big one for me is curiosity, not judgment. And so I don't know if you've seen the show Ted Lasso on Apple TV.
I have not.
I highly recommend it. It is just, it's mind-blowingly incredible.
Yeah.
And it's funny and light and all of that, but it's also just it shows the impact that one person can have on a whole organization.
Yeah.
Just from this idea of being curious and not judgmental.
Right.
And so that's something I really try to do as well, is before I engage in like getting upset or feeling frustrated that somebody did something or said something, I try to really, and again, maybe that's part of that coaching training I have too, is to just start to get curious about, I wonder why that happened or what they were thinking. And there's a lot of that in working with organizations and that kind of thing too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
sorry. So that's a lot of them, but that's
awesome.
the ones
That's
that drive
awesome.
me.
And I so relate that this, coming at the world from this place of curiosity, just being curious, not judgmental, is helpful. I want to share something with everybody. This is a testimonial that I found on Dimple's website, and I thought it was so cool, and it so relates to what you were just saying. Dimple is an open, accepting, and deeply knowledgeable and compassionate teacher. She made the material interesting and relevant, and it always felt like an ongoing conversation. That's pretty significant. She skillfully navigated obstacles and makes everyone feel seen and heard. I love this last sentence. The class was like getting a warm hug wrapped in a blanket of knowledge. That is awesome. That is awesome. Head and heart, right? Head and heart.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Dimple Dhabalia, thank you so much for making the time to sit in with me today. This has been a fascinating conversation, and your work is so needed and so inspiring. And if people were interested in getting in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
My website is a great place. So it's just www.rootsintheclouds.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And as always, whatever platform you happen to be listening to this podcast on, please see the episode notes, and Dimple's website URL will be in there. Please, please, please reach out to her. This is such important work for anybody that is working with other human beings. So, Dimple, thank you. Thank you for doing this work, and I wish you all the best. I have a feeling you are going to be pretty busy.
Well, thank you. That's the hope. So, but Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the work that you do.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And we will stay in touch, because I really do want to, maybe somewhere down the line, to get back in and see where this has progressed to, especially on the organizational level. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I. And let me say, because I know that many of our listeners come from the helping professions, all different types of helping professions. Please, 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 as always, take good care of yourself. Make yourself a priority. Depending upon the populations you work with, if you relate very much to what Dimple was talking about in terms of seeing yourself as someone who does high human impact work. Doubly take care of yourself. And if you happen to work in a system that maybe says the right things but doesn't back it up, then take the responsibility to find the places in your world where you can take care of yourself and be around people who can help nurture that in you. Thank you so much for sitting in with us today, and I hope that you make the time in your day to join us for our next episode as we continue to shine a light on the skill and talent of those individuals that invite another into that compassionate, complex, and intimate space called the Helping Conversation. Everybody, have a wonderful and full of wellness day.
We thank you for sitting in on our discussion today on just one unique version of the Helping Conversation. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's podcast, so we sincerely invite you to follow, rate, and most importantly, review our episodes. For more information on Keith Greer and this podcast, log on to keithgreercoaching.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue the exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of the Helping Conversation.